Right. Well, first of all, yes, I want to congratulate HPRIC on the 20 years of its survival, and thank you enormously for all your support of the Bat Group. It's made a huge difference to what we can do. And bats are certainly really important because they serve as indicator species of the health of the environment. If you've got a good diversity of plants, that can lead to a good diversity of insects and can provide the food for all our bat species, of which Hampshire is a really special place. So let's start with the basics. What is a record? Well, here's one I made earlier in the 1960s, but enough of that. What we need for a record is these sort of things. And for bats, there are challenges with all of this. I always say that bat surveying is rather like bird surveying with two difficulties. It's dark, so you can't see them, and they use ultrasound, so you can't hear them. So bat work is a challenge, but we've tried to record all those things, and we've made a huge amount of progress since 2002. Just outline some of them, but as you can see here, there's a load of different ways in which we've changed. No need to spell out some of these. It's just in this talk, I will try to enlarge on what some of these things actually mean. Okay, assuming you've seen that, where did we start? Well, the Hampshire Bat Group goes back much, much earlier. The county bat groups mostly originate from the reaction to the 1981 Wildlife and Countryside Act, where bats receive special protection. They're all, of course, now European protected species. The Hampshire Bat Group was founded in 1984, and within 2 years was producing species maps, but of course, relatively crude. We've got a 10-kilometer grid here, and we can see a relatively restricted number of species surveyed. And you may notice that pipistrelle bats are all there as one category, and the same is true for long-eared bats. It's rather interesting to see, with a huge amount of work that was going on in those days, how much was being recorded, and of course maps being drawn out by hand on paper. This is where we are now. We are able to not only record and plot out our records on a tetrad scale, but we can drill into that as I'll show. Notice there are still some gaps, but we're trying to address that with a fill the gaps project. Plotting the same data as 1 by 1 kilometer squares does rather highlight the gaps, and when you focus in on some of those areas, you can see that there's definitely areas that we need to concentrate on. The dots are the locations where we have at least one record, and then there's the monads plotted as well. So how are our records today? Well, in my database here on this computer at this moment, there's that number of records, and when I got into it, I started helping with this in 2013, we had a rather smaller number. Our records actually go back a long way, very, very few such ancient records, but thanks to the Portsmouth Museum Service and their taxonomy exhibits that have been looked through in recent years, our oldest record is a greater horseshoe bat at Christchurch Priory in 1902. I don't think you'll find one there now, but if you look under the misericords, you might find there's carvings of them from the Middle Ages. Most of our records come from Hampshire, but I have to admit that our database does include sites that overlap the border, and so some of our records are from the adjacent vice counties. We have a load of folks who contribute. It's difficult to give an accurate figure because some people are listed twice under married names and previous names, that sort of thing, but we've clocked up a huge number of people who've contributed to our database over the years. And of course, the older records in some cases are very simple, are just recorded as a bat, but things have got incredibly sophisticated now, way beyond my dreams when I first got into the Hampshire Bat group at the start. For example, we can get records from DNA analysis of bat droppings and tissues, and so when you look through our records you find an impressive number that result from that sort of level of precision. And then there's a lot of records that have come from experts working under license to capture bats so they can verify the identity of them. With some bat species you need one or the other of those techniques to know what you're dealing with. And there's also an impressive number of bats that have been radio tracked to try to work out where their roosts are so that the roosts can be conserved. This is the checklist of all the British bats as it stands at the moment. There's 17 British breeding species, and all of those have been recorded at some time or other in Hampshire. And so Hampshire is a very special county, and the one exception is the last on this list, the greater mouse-eared bat, of which, to scientific knowledge, as far as that goes, there's only a single male left. But arguably that may venture into Hampshire because it's regularly found in hibernation near us in West Sussex. So we've got all those species, and of course time won't permit me going into any details about them. But what I'd like to point out is that going back to the beginning of our database, there was only one long-eared bat. Now we recognize the brown and the very rare grey species. The pipistrelle bat, we now know we've got the common and the soprano, and also, in fact, the Nethusices and possibly the Coul's pipistrelle. So the number of species has been changing all the time. At one stage, we introduced sort of temporary taxonomic groupings before it was certain that we had the common and soprano as separate species, but now we know that. There's new species that have come in over the period of the last 20 years. We've discovered that we definitely have those two species, the Alcathoe and the Nethusicis pipistrelle. We're also concentrating more on the groups where the bats are difficult to identify. The small Myotis bats, those three species are a problem area. And as I said, it's questionable as whether the greater mouse-eared bat has ever been in Hampshire and whether it is now effectively extinct. Just spend a few moments looking at some of those species. The Alcathoe bat was first noticed in this country in 2010. Here's a news item from that time. And of course, it was particularly interesting when it was discovered in Sussex to find out if we actually had it here in Hampshire. Well, it's an odd thing. It was first picked out from the other species by investigators in Greece as recently as 2001. And there's various things about it, particularly the difficulty of identifying it. You really need an expert who's able to look at the teeth. The echolocation is pretty similar to the other bats. DNA is really the most reliable way to sort them out, particularly if you haven't got one of the handful of experts on hand. And it throws doubt on previous records of the other small Myotis species pre-2010. That's what they look like. Hampshire has the distinction of actually having one of these being lodged with our rehabilitators. Sadly, it died before we realized what it was, but we sent off the DNA and established that that's exactly what it was. Now we have records from very much the east, particularly the southeast of the county. So southeast and that whole eastern border with Sussex and Surrey is a priority area for attempting to conserve this bat. One thing I should point out that it's so new and so rare that it's not even named in the legislation. And while it would very much justify being an Annex II species, it's not mentioned. To sort out what these bats are, you need to find bat droppings, but in some roosts there's no shortage of those. Here we see a variety of sizes representing three species, serotine, brown long-eared and pipistrelle. And you look at these under the microscope, and if you're lucky, you see bits of insects. So bat droppings are really important, not only to identify the bat species involved, but you can identify the insects or other arthropods that they're eating, partly by recognizing the bits and pieces, but even better by sending off DNA samples for the insect identification. This is what you get back. Here's a very special report that we got back from the laboratory. This one, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you've got the grey long-eared, which is very, very rare. And at the same batch, we sent off a sample that turned out to be Alcathoe, but you can make mistakes. One sample we sent in the same batch, and I have to admit this is my fault, turned out to be a common house mouse. Anyway, another record for the mammal group. A big change that we've been able to make is by automatic recording systems. So we're not just going around with handheld bat detectors, which have, of course, got much more sophisticated over the 20 years, but now we're deploying devices like this, which give us huge numbers of recordings. They record all night, every night, record anything that sounds like a bat, and you have special software that sorts out the records and attempts to identify it, but it's not totally reliable. So there's a huge amount of work for us in manual checking before we can verify the species. Recently, smaller and much cheaper similar devices have been found, have been introduced, and the Hampshire Bat Group has a set of these as well as the other types, and we can deploy them in people's gardens and other sites to gather information. The automatic identification software is very sophisticated, and here's a recording I made last summer, which I'm particularly proud of, where we have both a greater horseshoe bat and a barbastelle bat, both Annex II species, simultaneously. Well, the software has to be treated, as I say, with caution, but I had a look at this recording and I've no doubt as to what we see there. Where do our records come from? They come from a wide variety of sources and not just from the Hampshire Bat Group's own activities. Huge numbers of records come in nowadays from ecological consultants. A very large number of consultancies are regularly sending us records, although we're still tickling other groupings to send them in. The online recording apps like Living Record are very prolific, very useful, and there are various other sources as you see there. How do these reach us? Well, our observers can report to us directly. They can send the information via Living Record or iRecord, which I then monitor and verify and collect the records from those sources. Then there are the people who work for Natural England as roost visitors who answer public inquiries. Their reports don't go directly to us, but to the Bat Conservation Trust, which is then able to send them to us, although sadly they've been severely redacted and are not as useful as they could be. And similarly from the National Bat Monitoring Programme, that again feeds to the Bat Conservation Trust and ultimately, if I'm lucky, in highly redacted form to the Hampshire Bat Group. Hampshire Bat Group then synchronizes, one more, consultants, as I mentioned earlier. Hampshire Bat Group synchronizes with HBIC as often as we can, and we're very grateful to have that facility, and that makes the data available to, for example, data searches, as Nikki mentioned earlier, for planning purposes and similar, but HBIC very kindly forward many of the data searches where the requests are for bats only to us, so we are able to supply those to consultancies, and that is a very valuable source of income stream for the Hampshire Bat Group. HBIC, of course, supplies the information to the county ecologist team and to many statutory bodies, although, as we mentioned earlier, very sadly, no longer to Natural England. The Bat Conservation Trust does other things. For example, sends information to the National Biodiversity Network, but you have to then realise that when you examine all the arrows, that the National Biodiversity Network and Natural England are sadly isolated from our main bat databases. There's been some really significant records over the years, the first barbastell, the first Bechstein, the first grey long-eared bat, great rarities, the first Alcathoe bat, and even some interesting vagrants that could, in theory, colonize this country in future years. Barbastell looks like that. There we see the value of our New Forest bat box scheme, in that we're able to locate colonies.
2 minutes, Nick.
Thank you. Barbastell really extensive in this county now, probably more so, need more surveys. Bechsteins confined only to a few areas, but again, a particular interest and concentration in the southeast of the county, where more protection from development pressures is urgently needed. And the grey long-eared looks like that, extremely rare, one outlier at Basingstoke a couple of years ago, but otherwise along the fringes of the coast and Dorset. Brown long-eared, in contrast, is a hugely widespread species. And finally, just to give you the idea of the impact of the high definition thermal imaging, here you can see how we can examine roosts, how we can zoom in with fantastic quality and see exactly what's going on. That first bat was carrying one of our rings. Here the bats are echolocating as they come out from between gaps in the tiles of the roof. Okay, so I'll go on to invite questions. I'll stop there.
Okay, so morning, Nick. We've had a question from Kathy Wilson.
Yes.
Can I get a Hampshire Bat group member to come and help identify record bats in my attic? We often see them at dusk and have droppings galore. I'm 3 miles east of Alton.
Yes, I'm sure we could help. The best thing is to, that is the credits, but is to look at our website there, and you'll see right at the bottom there, in this new website I've just been building, my email address. So write to me there and I'll see what I can do, or what our members generally can do to help. Any more questions?
No, I think that's it, Nick. Thank you very much for that. That was a real brilliant run through. And I love those thermal images at the end.
Aren't they fun? Yeah, they're great.
Thanks very much.